we get into the D&D isms of it, this is exactly the approach that the game Scion takes. And it makes another connection that is sometimes found in Irish folklore, where because of their association with Lugh and their craftsmanship and their love of gold, they were called Little Stooping Lugh.
I don't think I've heard that one, actually.
And the linguistics of that is Lugh Corpan, which is then translated in later folklore. Potentially, again, the connections here are always possible and fast and loose.
Yeah.
But
everything here is going to have the asterisk on it because it's just kind of how it works, especially when we get that far back in history. And,
because it's folklore and there is no canon.
Right.
Yeah.
No mythology, no folklore. None of it has a canon. Give up the idea that there's one story to rule them all. It will not happen. But some people believe that Lugh Corpan morphed over time into leprechaun. So the little craftsmen who hoard their gold at the end of the rainbow, which, by the way, is in fact one of the symbols of Lugh because of the sword that he wielded, which belonged to many kings before him. But we'll get into that again in another episode.
We're laying seeds. That's what we're doing. We're laying seeds. We're prepping for it.
Absolutely are.
Yeah.
But yeah, so honestly, in many ways, the possibly more accurate mythological portrayal of the Firbolg would be as small folk, and certainly there seems to be a connection to the leprechauns. Which brings us then to the beginning of Dungeons and Dragons, first edition, where we have the Firbolg shown as giants. Now, you'll notice that the only giant that Greg mentioned in his entire discussion was one of the Tuatha.
Mm-hmm.
It was the Dagda, or the good god. And he's a huge, big, red-headed guy who, by the way, just like about half of the other Tuatha, is also part Fomor. It's complicated.
It is.
Just like the Asir and the Vanir, both interbred with the Jotun to a huge extent. Odin is like half Jotun, Thor is like 3/4. We'll get into that probably another time as well. By probably, I mean definitely. Anyway. So the only giant that's mentioned in that whole story is the Dagda. Now, some of the Fomor were certainly described as giants. Balor of the Evil Eye foremost among them, but there are certainly others. But the Firbolg are never described that way. Nonetheless, when we get to Dungeons and Dragons, there are a number of creatures that are just sort of made into giants because they didn't know what to do with them. As Greg said in our discussion prior to the stream today.
Well, for a lot of, if I can jump in here, for a lot of what they did with the Firbolg in first edition, and like I'm sure we're going to get into a lot of that, it very much didn't pull anything almost from the like original like mythos and the history that we have for these people. It was a lot more attributed to what I would have to say is more Viking or Nordic in how they were presented and how they were attributed in the games. It was really almost a strange shift. I'm not sure why that happened. I don't know if we know the stories behind that, but it was a really interesting decision. Interesting is the word I'll choose because I'm trying not to be mean, but it was a very unique decision to make that really didn't make sense.
There seems to be a lot of reticence in earlier editions prior to fourth to make anything that comes from folklore into fae, because they're trying to reserve fae specifically for what we refer to as kind of Victorian fairies with wings doing their things like quicklings.
Right, which is really unreasonable.
But there's a lot of stuff that should have been shoved in there that comes from folklore didn't, and instead it ends up morphing into weird stuff. And with giants in particular, what they ended up doing is it looks like they looked at different types of mythologies, particularly European, but sometimes in some Middle Eastern mythology as well. And they just kind of like, okay, let's get them to be really tall humans and let's dress them like Vikings and let's just see how that works out.
This seems cool. People will like that.
Yeah, I mean, who doesn't love a cannibalistic giant?
They especially note that despite the fact that we have consistently described the Firbolg as darker than everyone else, the Firbolg in the first edition of D&D and for several editions thereafter are blonde or red-haired with pale pinkish skin,
Yep.
long thick beards, as you say, extremely Viking, and the most human of the giants.
Yes, yeah, I
Yes.
think that's really important to note too. That is something that they go out of their way more than once to talk about in early editions. I think it was like 83 or something when they first introduced the Firbolg. And that is something that they really
It first
do.
appeared in it first appeared in Monster Manual 2, first edition.
Yeah, and they really do go out of their way more than once in that book, and in future books that they would release that had information on them to ensure that you knew that they were the most humanoid of the giants. They were the most human of the giants, and to make them again, they really fit into that Viking box specifically, and it just it felt like, for me at least, when I was introduced to it, which was years later, obviously, it very much felt like that was just sort of jammed in there because they needed something to make it unique, and that was just kind of the way they went with it at the time. A lot of the different concepts that would later be fleshed out or become at least a little bit more related to the concepts that they really were things that they just said, this is cool, we're going to lean on some exoticism to pull these things out of it, and then we're going to Euro whitewash it and push it out, because it's just kind of what they knew. And I'm not defending it in any way, but that's kind of where that went.
We'll get into that in one of the panels that we'll also see later, because it's not just Euro whitewashing. In most cases, the Eurocentrism that people see isn't just Eurocentrism. It's specifically Anglo.
That's fair. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
The rest of Europe, other than parts of France, is mostly ignored in medieval fantasy literature, most of which is actually Renaissance, because it has everything but guns. It has rapiers, it has full plate. These are not medieval things.
And that's why in series like The Witcher, which is very much based on like this trend of fantasy that's coming out of the West into the Eastern Bloc, it's based on kind of this like Anglo-Celtic fantasy that they kind of lean into, and like, oh, how can we do something? Oh, we're Polish. Let's use some Polish and Slavic mythology and bring that in. And now The Witcher has come to America. It's become this big thing where like, oh, now we have like this gateway into Slavic mythology that's actually become really interesting. But,
I was actually focusing a lot on Slavic mythology before that, so I was kind of happy to see it. But I'm also I like The Witcher, but I'm also kind of irritated at the author because he will not acknowledge his debt to Moorcock.
I can see that. I haven't done a lot of looking into like where his stuff comes from, but he definitely has kind of a Moorcock.
Well, it's not that he specifically refers to Geralt of Rivia as the White Wolf. His world.
That's fair. Yeah.
They talk about the 10,000 spheres, which is and the conjunction of the 10,000 spheres, which is straight out of Moorcock's Eternal Champion series.
Yes. Yeah.
And
I've only read Elric, but
yeah, it actually happens in some of the Elric novels, as well as the other Eternal Champion novels. And anyway, that's a digression for another day. So, one of the things I will get to, and one of the reasons I think we see the Firbolg as giants and as Vikings specifically, is that some of the folklorists believe that the Firbolg and the Fomor were the same, that they were in fact the same people. And if you take that approach, then okay, I can see the giants. The Viking aspect comes in with the fact that much later, after the Viking raids on Northern Ireland and Scotland really get into full swing, they start referring to the Vikings as Fomor because they come out of the sea.
Yeah, and you see a lot of that too with how they describe the Fomorians as pirates in some literature.
Right. Because of that conflation of these two originally very separate groups, that's where you get both the giant aspect and the Viking aspect. You also get, in some of the versions throughout it, you get the idea that the Firbolg can change to become human-sized.
Yes. Yeah.
Which actually comes from the Welsh creature called the Spriggan, which is normally a dwarf, but maybe the ghost of a giant who became a dwarf and can morph back to its full size.
Right.
Because, of course, there's very little distinction between Fae and the dead in the versions of the folklore that we've got. Not that they didn't have that distinction to begin with, but that once they had to pigeonhole the Fae into something in a post-Christian world, they had basically only two options: fallen angels that weren't all the way to hell, or the ghosts of the dead. And they didn't really make a lot of distinction between the two.
Mm-hmm. And with Ireland in particular, they ended up tying this a lot to the land, where basically the land is littered with these stories called Din Shinhoth, which are basically tales of the land and how the land came to have its name, or how it had its shape and whatnot. And so you've got things like the place where Lou is inevitably drowned at the end of one of his many lives, is now called Loch Lou in the middle of Ireland. And there's a place actually near the first Battle of Mointure where there's an alternate version where Lou is, as a child, killed. And so you can see Lou's grave there. So there's some stories tied to that. And of course, like you said, there's no canon. So how can Lou both be dead as a child and end up becoming one of the High Kings of Ireland? So I don't know. And you got to figure out a way to figure it out.
Ask yourself how Dionysus became the Thriceborn.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So basically, with these Shinhas, what you end up seeing is that there are these tales where eventually, after the Gaels have settled in Ireland, and Gaels are the sixth group of the Laborca Valera. Eventually, after the Tuatha De Danann, they lose the nobility, and they end up getting invaded by these people from what's probably Galatia and Spain. And they end up invading and becoming them. In the story, they're called the Milesians, but we call them the Gaels now. And so they're the modern Irish people that continue to live in Ireland to this day.
The Goidelic, that was the arrival of the Goidelic Celts.
Yeah. And so they end up coming and they take over from the Tuatha De Danann, who end up going under the hills, under the land. So that's why we've got these hollow hills, these cairns and whatnot. And so you see all these different myths that after humans have been established, and whether they've been Christianized or not is irrelevant to the myth. The Fae, the fair folk, end up coming out of the ground, and there are spirits that come and talk to them. And so that's why at certain times, like Samhain, whatnot, the dead wander and you can see them. Right. At night, if you end up waking up in a cave, suddenly there might be a feast of these spirits going on. And so a lot of these stories are from the fact that they have incorporated the dead into their living memory and myth and their storytelling traditions that continued on well into writing.
You also have the fact that a great many of the realms of the dead in ancient Celtic myth in general are also the realms of things that once were gods but are now seen as fae. So Tirnanog, Anuvin, all of these have fae rulers, and the souls of the dead reside there.
Right.
So there's a lot of reasons for the conflation of the dead and the fae in that regard. It comes from the same world. How are you going to know the difference?
Right.
Like many cultures, there isn't, while there may be separate kingdoms in the spirit world, there's not necessarily a separate world of the dead and world of the spirits. They are the same spirit world.
Right. And so it's worth noting that in various established settings of Dungeons and Dragons, they've tried to incorporate this to kind of make it a little more mythical. The only one that even comes close to succeeding is the ever-present Forgotten Realms, where they try to incorporate the Firbolg, particularly into the Moonshade Islands, which are just a pastiche of various Welsh, Irish, Scottish myths, and they try to bring them in. There's druids, and the Firbolg are these giants that are kind of defenders, and they are kind of private. They don't really mess with humans because they've been betrayed by them in the past. So from a storytelling perspective, they try to incorporate them into this mythology they built, because the Moonshades was the first area of the Forgotten Realms that got a novel.
Yeah.
I think it's a good novel, but it's the first place they got a novel. And so basically, they brought them in. They were this kind of mythical people that not a lot of people believed in. They lived in the hills in the forest, and they were these defenders. They worshipped a particular obscure giant god that was kind of outside the ordning. For those who don't know, in particularly Forgotten Realms giant lore, the ordning is kind of the system of how the giants, basically it's a hierarchy, a caste, and giant kin like the Firbolg are kind of outside of the caste. So the main caste is like sky giants and fire giants, and all the way down to hill giants.
Of Greenwood's specific giant lore for his world, and has been kind of transposed onto other worlds, like many things. As D&D tries to, for whatever reason, genericize all of its worlds. I'm like, why? Like,
kitchen sink settings are rarely.
Let's add the Feywild to Kryn. Why?
Wider appeal.
Yeah. So that's why in a lot of a lot of D&D settings, you don't actually see a lot of developed, like, established Fey lore, because there's like, they might mention, oh, it's the realm of fairy, and that's where Oberon and Titania rule alongside the Queen of Air and Darkness. And so that's like something the Forgotten Realms mentions for most of first and second edition, but doesn't actually go into. Never really goes into. Like, they might give you, like, okay, if you want to be a cleric of Titania, here's your spheres, go for it. And then in third edition, that changes whenever they actually introduce Eberron, and Eberron has an established specific Fey realm that is actually connected to Eberron, because they've got their 13 or 12 different,
and a very different cosmology than
stuff.
every other D&D setting before it. And one of the reasons I liked it so much is that it was refreshing, and it did not just grab everything from everybody else. One of the reasons I liked Forgotten Realms was because it was a realm before he ever sold it to D&D.
Right. Yeah, and it's kind of this. It's meant to be this shared storytelling. That was why he sold it to them to begin with. But now it's there's a movie set in it. How the hell did that happen?
Right.
But basically, like, third edition didn't do a lot with the Firbolg. They were in, I think, Monster Manual 2. Because that was my introduction to the Firbolg, even as a concept. I had no idea where they came from. They were just like this cool dude who has a sword on his back and he's next to a bear. Okay, what a cool dude. I like him. Whatever. But I didn't do it.
Go ahead and give us that picture.
Yeah. I think 2002 is when that was released.
Yeah, that's the third edition version of it.
Yeah.
Yes, and I thought they were neat. I always wanted to use them in one of my homebrew worlds, because I didn't use established worlds until 5th edition, but I just never got around to it, because giants are not really my thing, especially as they're portrayed in D&D. But so I guess we differ there. But
I don't use giants in D&D very much, but I
just
do have
in real life.
I do right. No, killing giants is what I do for my day job.
Yeah.
Anyway, so the giants in the Forgotten Realms, I am not super fond of. I love the Forgotten Realms. I've used the Forgotten Realms. It's probably one of the only established settings that I've used. Mostly I homebrew, just like you do. But I do have one setting that is very giant focused, but that's because it's a Norse bordering land, and it's focused on the Norse concept of giants. But so the Firbolg in 3E basically give us the clearest view of what a Firbolg as a giant in D&D was really supposed to feel like, right? You've got the animal behind them. You can tell they're nature oriented. They still have a little bit of the Viking feel to them in their visual representation, but here they are. They have a distinct character, right? And then 4th edition comes along.
Oh, please.
4th edition. As much as people deride it, I actually don't mind it that much. As a system, not my thing. I'm not going to yuck anybody else's yum, but the system's not my thing. But as far as what they tried to revise the lore in various ways,
absolutely,
sure,
no,
kind of love it.
Yeah,
I loved a lot of the lore from 4th Ed, and I loved the concept of the Points of Light's civilization trying to reestablish itself.
Yeah,
because it tied so well into the base conceit of Dungeons and Dragons.
The problem,
the ruins of the past for the sake of the future.
Yeah. The problem that they ran into, though, was, and the Firbolg are a really good example of that, is that some things really did heavily get pushed aside and monsterized, demonized. They took away a lot of what made some of these people who we had access to in earlier editions into just scary folk. And that
the worst example is the gnome. I'm a monster.
Sure, yes.
I don't even like gnomes, and that made me mad.
That's so fair.
So here we see the picture, and these Firbolg are pretty obviously cannibalistic monster things with their big sharp fangs and their stereotypical barbarian outfit and barbarian outlook.
Yeah, they've got the glazed over eyes and the sharp teeth and the like purposefully spiked, like non-traditional shaped weapons, and everything about them screams run.
Yes.
Right. And this is a picture that I would use for some of the less unpleasant looking Fomor rather than Firbolg.
Yeah.
Again, the whole reason they're giants is probably because of the conflation anyway.
Mhm.
But then something happens. That something is called Critical Role. And we get a new image of the Firbolg, even more as a natural creature and protector. But it looks like this.
Yeah.
And what, in the name of everything, both holy and unholy, where do you get here from there?
Well, a lot of what they wanted to do, it's interesting because it comes from two different directions, right? Before we get into the Critical Role stuff, the basic concept, they really wanted to step away from that idea of just the terrifying, cannibalistic giants, which, I mean, great, because we needed to. And they did that thing where, as Greg mentioned earlier, this idea of a lot of mythology kind of gets pushed into the Fae realm. That's where it goes, and that's what happened here. Is a lot of that got moved over and pushed over there, and so they leaned
Back.
into it. Well, yes, back, and it they leaned into it very hard. They wanted to make it. They wanted to make sure they didn't make a lot of the same mistakes they made before. They wanted to shift away from this concept of just them being these human giant folk, and they wanted to give them more of a purpose and a personality that would at least somewhat call back to the origins of the Firbolg as a people that everything's based on.
A little bit. The problem is, of
Sure.
course, that they had hoist themselves on their own petard.
Yes.
They were stuck with the Firbolg as giants.
Yes.
They couldn't do the obvious thing and take them back to their roots as a fairy folk who might be little stooping loos, for instance.
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
thought it was interesting. So when they come out in Bolo's Guide to Monsters, there's that first picture that comes out that kind of like the Critical Role runs with, and like that makes it the big. That's what Firbolg looks like. Everybody's into it. But when it comes out, if you read the description of them in Bolo's Guide to Monsters, there's no description of them whatsoever.
Correct.
So basically, I guess whatever art direction they gave that particular artist to is one of my favorites for 5th edition. They do a lot of really good work in Tomb of Annihilation, especially. Basically, they just kind of made their own thing. I don't know why the nose is pink. I don't know why the skin is blue. Maybe they were trying to borrow from it, but I think they were trying to make them more original. And they add a lot of cultural stuff as well, where like you don't know what their true names are. Their names are something along the line of, okay, I picked an elven name or a sylvan name, and I am now sharing that with you, but it is not my true name, for we do not share those outside of our tribe.
Yeah.
And so that's very interesting. And the fact that they're now like these hidden people in the forest and they're kind of natural defenders that, and most PCs are banished from their tribes. And we're basically like, you can't stay with us. You gotta go do something else. And so that ends up causing an issue. And oftentimes that's just a story hook that people run with for whatever reason. I've had one Firbolg in a game, and we didn't really do much with that, but I enjoyed it. And initially, I kind of pushed back a little bit against, like, well, why is there this massive retcon? They're so different. But at the same time, I was kind of like, I like it. I think before that, there was nothing that distinguished the Firbolg from anything that was happening in prior editions.
Yes.
There wasn't like, okay, they're
there's no reason to have them if you just want monster giants. You don't need them.
Before we get too far off of it, I do want to mention, I think it's important to note that one of the weaknesses in a lot of this, and like you said, there's no description included in the book, right? It was just kind of whatever they sent to the artist, and that's what they're going with. Volo's is a really interesting case, and they recreate that later with things like Mordenkainen's and other books, where they make it clear to you that these are being told from a certain perspective, and Volo specifically is suggested to be this unreliable narrator, which is a really cool gimmick, but terrible when you're trying to provide insight on new options for races or anything else, because you run into these problems where, well, this is what they look like now, and then they would shift again later because with the Critical Role stuff and making them even more bovine there's not really too much of a baseline, because what we're presented with is already with an asterisk of, well, but maybe not. So when the next loudest voice in the room is like, this is what they look like, that's what people gravitate to. And it really does play a big role.
It's especially bad when both it is saying, well, maybe not, but it's also saying this is everywhere. Not just this is this in this world.
Yes.
Right.
but the ongoing concept that D&D has, that the creatures and types are the same across worlds, which I think is a really bad idea.
Yeah, because there's a
Makes
lot of
not an
incongruities
individual
across
one.
all these races.
Right.
Like Dark Sun especially like takes the races and turns them into wildly different things that you really
Does.
can't rely on anything any other book is telling you if you
Yes.
want to learn about elves or halflings or anything.
Right.
So and then
I
Eberron does
I
that too, where they
love
just
that.
get a lot of these races and make them very different.
Right. I love the Eberron orc and half orc, for instance.
Mhm.
Well,
Oh
because
god, yes,
it's
I
so
love them so
important.
much.
It's so important to be able to do that because you don't want a situation where you just have these different worlds that are the same world with slightly different skins.
Then why bother?
Right? Yeah. Why bother? At that point, just set it in a different part of the Forgotten Realms. But
Just go Forgotten Realms or Greyhawk and
right,
go.
but they really do such a good job of that. And anytime that they do exactly what you're saying here, where they're just like, this is how they are everywhere, it detracts from the ability to create these really interesting concepts of who they are and what they are and where they come from.
I liked some of the multiversal concepts that they introduced in Fizban's Guide to Dragons, right?
Okay.
Yes,
sure.
I love
yes,
it.
Also
Yes.
hated them because it says these dragons are the same in all worlds and all these dragons are connected across all worlds
Right.
and blah 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 blah.
And the fact that they tried to make Eberron like connected it to the elegy of the first world, that okay, it's just a recreation of the original myth between Tiamat and Bahamut. And so basically how they're trying to like as a Planescape fan, and I'm a huge Planescape fan. It is my bread and butter. I was not a second edition person originally, but when I went back, I went in Planescape and like I lived there mentally constantly. It is my favorite setting of all time, and I will fight anyone who dislikes it. Especially if
I
it's
will
because they like
probably
play
be
a
very
spelljammer.
upset when I will probably be very upset when Wizards produces their new version of Planescape. Just as I was
Coming in
upset
with
when they produced their
I'm
recent.
coming in with kind of careful expectations, but I'm kind of excited because fifth edition has been built around this idea that Planescape is canon pure. Like the DMG is very Planescape friendly.
Yeah.
It's based on Planescape. They built it into the system and they got rid of a lot of the mechanical stuff that was kind of a nightmare to mess with. Like, okay, you got to worry about your alignment, got to worry about your proximity to your gun, you got to worry about all this stuff. So now we've got this magical percentile that maybe your magic doesn't work or maybe you're just going to lose your mind. So they kind of pulled away from that a little bit and made it more like this is a method of storytelling. But then there's also kind of the canon aspects of, well, they blew it up at the end of second edition. How are we going to go back to that? Because the thing that people are drawn to is basically the lore, the factions, things like that.
Yeah,
and
it's
so
really interesting stuff.
The Firbolg are actually an exception to that rule, where basically there was this old lore, and it's still technically true in the Forgotten Realms, but the depiction, specifically, it's the image. Nothing else has changed. It's the image that they use has kind of upset that. And so a lot of old grognards are like, I'm angry about that. But at the same time, you have to remember it's Volo. And technically, you should have been doing that anyway, because when Volo was writing all the guides in second edition, should you really have been trusting him when he was talking about all these taverns and, okay,
No,
there's this certain area in here outside of Waterdeep?
I loved having those Volo's guides handed out as real things in the world and having them be wrong.
That and Winter's Catalog. Those things are like perfect tools.
So good. Yeah.
Yep. Absolutely.
So I think one of the things that with fifth edition, I think that a lot of older fans especially are having to wrestle with is this idea that basically canon is what you make of it. And you can use it as much as you want, but you shouldn't feel beholden to it because it's ultimately your table in your world. Now, if you want to run a simulation of the Forgotten Realms, you've got a lot of things you've got to navigate. You've got like 257 some odd novels and a bunch of splat books that of varying qualities. Most of them are pretty good, but varying quality. And then you've got to deal with the problems with fourth edition and whatnot. But at the same time, if you want to just step back and do something else with it, you're more than welcome to. You don't have to go in and go into the deep history of Mystra's now 3 deaths and original form.
Even more so than mythology and folklore.
Mm-hmm.
You must accept that in tabletop role playing, there is no canon but the one you choose.
Yes, that's so
any
important.
World, even if you're using a published world, any world that you're using is yours the moment you step into it. Everything is subject to the will of the table and the decisions of the game master.
Yes.
And it's something that I think does get lost way too often, right? Like that's something that you do see in a lot of arguments where it's like, it has to be done this way because that's how it's supposed to be done. And I think one of the things that really makes TTRPGs so great is that opportunity to be like, well, I really like this framework, or I like what's happened up until now.
Right.
But here's how I will make it more fun for me and my players. And ultimately, there's no argument that can possibly be more valid than we want to have fun when playing these games.
Right. Yeah.
And one of the things that
drew me to new...
Go ahead.
To respond to the chat, D&D business model depends on canonizing as much as possible. Well, guess what? We are not beholden to them.
Correct.
You're right, Marty. You absolutely are. But we are not beholden to them either. We tell the story at our table, or we run the game at our table, depending on your approach, because it doesn't have to be story focused. There are many ways to play the game.
Sure.
The table is where the play happens, and we decide what happens there. And even more now that things like Tales from the Valiant with their core fantasy is coming out, and Critical Role is creating Daggerheart and all these other things, we are not beholden to the warlocks of the shore.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. The Lawful Neutral said it in chat, and I really like that. The table alone is canon. And that's
correct.
Just that should always be the golden rule for any time that you play any TTRPG. If you want to religiously follow the lore as it has been set out in the canon, as it has been presented to you by the company that writes it or the author who has created that world, great. There's zero wrong with that. But it's just as valid of a way to play as going, I don't like these things and we will be changing them.
When I use Forgotten Realms, my tendency is to accept only as canon those things that Ed wrote.
That's fair.
Yeah, because, that's fair.
Everything else is added on by a fan of his world, and I'm a fan of his world. So the only person who might possibly have a more valid take on it than me is the guy who made it.
Right.
It's just my same feeling with Keith Baker's work. If he puts out a supplement for Eberron, I don't care if it's not Wizards of the Coast. It's canon. That's Keith. 100%. That's his world.
Yeah.
Okay. So for me, and again, you don't have to do it that way because whatever, again, the table alone is canon. But if you're going to make these choices, respect the creator when you're doing it. Dragonlance is how Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman see it.
Yes.
I don't like a lot of it, but I respect their vision. Okay.
Yes.
I will not get into why I don't like a lot of it, but it has that may come up in a panel.
I'm happy to.
That's a whole new episode. That's a whole different episode. Like we can spend hours on that.
Probably not of this. It'd probably be one of my Sunday episodes.
Sure.
Right.
Because that's where I'm doing the hot topics. But yeah, to get back to the Firbolg now, one of the interesting things is your choice of the Firbolg means that we really only have, as far as I know, the two game lines to draw on for how they handle Firbolg in tabletop role playing. Because you see, if you were going to talk about orcs, obviously we know where orcs came from. Yes, they have a somewhat mythological basis, but as we know them, they completely are a creation of Tolkien, right? We're probably going to get into some of that on May 28th for the Evil Races panel and explaining why it's not quite what people think. But that's way more popular. You're going to see goblins everywhere, right? You see orcs and goblins. You see them in Cypher. You see them in Fantasy Age. You see them in all these games, right?
Changeling.
Say again?
Changeling, especially.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Changeling the
Lost in the Dreaming.
Changing the Dreaming, Changing the Lost. I ran a Changeling the Lost LARP for 6 years. I love that game. Anyway, it may be another one of the games I offer on Start Playing at some point. Actually, I know it is because I already have the template made, but it's Arcadian Dreams, the Oz Narnia War.
I like that.
Yeah. It's a Changeling Chronicle set entirely in Arcadia.
That's hella unique. I like it.
So we don't have as many games to look at for Firbolg, right? We have this translation for D&D 5, we have D&D 1 through 4, we have the Firbolg as giant all the way up. If we were to, and then we have just a generalized look at the Firbolg in Scion, and I will bring that up now. And it specifically notes basically that the Firbolg eventually inspired the name of the leprechauns. They are humpbacked, prefer to dwell underground, pride in their craft skills. As we were saying, very clearly dwarvish, right? Now, one of the interesting things here is that in Scion, they call them the spawn of Crom Duv or Crom Cruach, which makes them Titan spawn the same way the dwarves are. Now, I'm not sure where they got that notion, but it probably goes back to the conflation of Firbolg with Fomor again. Since Crom Dove and Crom Cruach are sometimes seen as Fomor in some ancient things, even though Crom is actually an entirely separate set deity from the Tuatha De Danann setup, as far as I'm aware.
It's complicated.
Yeah. So we really only have those two pictures, right? We have the giant and we have basically a Gaelic dwarf. If we were to try to make a more faithful version of the Firbolg in any tabletop role-playing game, we're not necessarily worried super much about the system right now. We can get into that in a minute. But just conceptually, what do we want? What would we want to make them as? How do you think they would be most useful in a setting?
I mean, strictly, like I think it's important to be able to find that balance, right? Because useful has a lot of different ways that it can be described, especially in the TTRPG, right? Because you've got, you said like mechanics to the side, but even so, it's this idea of, when you say useful, do you mean just how they fit into the world, how they would best be represented, or what would make them functional as members of a party?
All of the above.
That's a hard question to answer with one answer.
It is. It very much is.
Yeah.
But
if I were to take a whack at it, one of the things I would want to consider is kind of going back to their mythological origins. There's a lot of connections to Earth, and so D&D has a tendency to throw them in a forest to be done with them. That's it. But Earth is a lot bigger than that, and especially if you look at things like, because they're thinking like, oh, a forest is natural. Well, fields are natural, so are mountains, and deserts, and pretty much everything. So I would want to reconsider what the relationship between the Firbolg and the Earth is, and lean into that as much as possible. Because keep in mind, these are people that migrated in theory or in the mythical history from Ireland to Greece. There's a lot of geographical difference between Ireland and Greece, and everything in between. Yep. So
the only thing they really
a very wide net as far as they're connected to nature. And essentially, they also have this inherent tie to Druidism, which it's mythologically messy. But since Taltu is both a sorceress, a sovereign goddess, and a druid, there's also this connection that rulership has to be connected to the land. The legitimacy comes from the land. And the system that exists has to be one that is tied to the legitimacy of that. And so I would want to go back and look at various Irish law systems prior to, I would say prior to Roman Christianity. Celtic Christianity preserves a lot of that. So I would want to lean into kind of Church of Columba and whatnot, what its laws were and whatnot. And basically how that kind of worked in there. Because it's worth noting that the Druids weren't wiped out until Roman law comes in. Like originally, Christians and Druids coexisted for.
Yep.
So there's not this divide between them, and so there's this. I'd also want to go back and look at what Druids actually are in myth, because D&D has a tendency to kind of erase a lot of that and turn them into kind of like these mystic eco warriors, which is great. I mean, it's very 90s thing, but
cool
at the same time,
not Druidic.
Yes. I'm reminded especially of Werewolf the Apocalypse and the Fianna, and especially that side of it, but like not really my take on Druids at all, because I think Druids you have to consider what their role is political. Druids are a very political system because they're tied to judging, they're tied to laws, they're tied to how these things are recorded and how things are given out. And so that's something that goes back to the Firbolg as far as Irish history goes. Now, technically, if you look at the Tuatha De Danann, there's a lot more druid stuff going on. So a lot of people draw druidry from them instead. But if I were to put them into a world, regardless of what system I was using, I would first want to consider the Earth. I would want to consider what their political aspects are and kind of like how they are as an in-group, because they don't necessarily have a problem with mixing with other groups if you want to look at myths, because they have no problem being subjugated and welcomed in, because I guess they all committed this genocide. Tuatha De Danann are supposed to be the good guys, so basically, I would want to consider how they treat others and how they treat outsiders, because it seems like compared to at least the Fomorians, they're a lot more hospitable. They're a lot nicer. And the part of that is they're tied to the land and the legitimacy of they live on the land, they are part of the land, and therefore they are the ones who are the shepherds of who can come and go on that land as well. And that is partially something I leaned into on the first season of Godyssey when I messed with that, where basically Taltu was teaching Lou that a lot of legitimacy is tied to the treatment of the land and whatnot, because when the Firbolg and the Tuatha De Danann are enslaved by the Fomorians, Ireland becomes desolate. And that's part of that's because Balor's eye is so powerful and is overall things looking for Lou because he wants to stop him because of prophecy. Right. But a lot of it's because they were getting them to work it to the bone. We're basically, hey, we aren't farmers ourselves, so you're going to be forced to farm for us. And basically, they're trying to destroy this connection to the land in the myth. And so I would want to tie it to things like that. And so if the system has like a divided magical system, I would lean more towards kind of the divine primal magic, whether you're using Pathfinder or more traditional D&D system. And if you're using something that's like Powered by the Apocalypse or World of Darkness, even something that is more earthen-based and elemental.
Yeah,
right. That goes.
I really like this idea that, building on what you said, I like the idea also that you incorporate these mystical elements of their ability to sort of take these desolated, damaged lands and nurse them back into whatever that may look like, because it doesn't have to just be through like farming lands or what have you, even just lands that have been ravaged by death or necromantic energies, or however far you want to take it, the ability for them to, as a people, be able to sort of have a hand in the rebirth and the refertilization of these areas, I think is a really cool thing to explore.
Yeah, kind of an Alfar or Vanir basis of fertility sub-deity, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So I had this idea just now. We know that the Irish were very big on place magic, which you talked about with the Tisenchas, right? And we're talking about them being tied to the fertility of the land, because, you know, they would specifically marry the earth goddess or the sovereignty goddess, who in many cases was an earth goddess, like Iru and Banba, and those were, you know, deities of the land itself, right? So it was a symbolic marriage to the land. So we're looking at not just primal, but specifically land-based, right? They get their magic, their power, their identity from being tied to land and getting their power from that specific land they're tied to. What other game, and this isn't a tabletop role-playing game, but it is in the tabletop role-playing game geek sphere. In what game does your power specifically come from the lands you own?
I mean, I want to be a little bit of a smartass here and be like Settlers of Catan.
Yeah, that's where my mind
is. Yes, but no. Magic the Gathering.
Yes, yeah. Very true.
Okay, that's so true,
basically, in game, you would have them draw power from one place, and if they're trying to get, it's true, it does. Birthright does do something like that on a much more individual level.
Yes.
What I'm talking about here is they would go around in at least their territory, but as many as others as they can, and tie themselves to each mystic place, thus getting the power that place gives.
Oh, I like that. And then you end up having all these different, like, I still hate calling them races. I really do. But these like sub legacies, lineages. I forget what Pathfinder calls it, because they have a ancestries.
It actually works in this case because it's more of a not just a magical. It's not just a an ethnic or genetic thing. It's a magical tradition thing.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah,
a
so like
lineage or a legacy makes the most sense.
yeah, I really like that idea of like a lineage where the places that they have called home and have brought themselves to and have bonded with shape who they are and what they look like, what kinds of things they can do, and all of that is just an absolutely phenomenal idea.
Chat, Marty brought up, what about Firbolgs as tutelaries? And this actually comes into what we were already talking about. Firbolg as a tutelary deity, like the equivalent of the Norse Landsveter, would basically be what we've just described. Each one is the deity or entity spirit of a very small area that is their feature, right? They become a fae in that regard, because that, of course, is mostly what fae are in many cases. But that also makes them like dryads. It makes them like oreads, because each of the nymphs has that same tie to a specific geographical or geological feature, right?
The lawful neutral over in chat actually brought up something really good that we kind of skipped over because we didn't talk about second edition Firbolgs that much, but how in second edition druids were expected to eventually adopt and stick with like a specific grove or location, and that's very true. That would 100% fit perfectly with what we're talking about here.
And yes, Tom Bombadil could have been considered a Firbolg. I would agree with that.
Yeah, I can agree with that.
Especially given what we were just talking about with him being a tutelary spirit, specifically of a forest. Absolutely. He's never called it in the book, but he is.
I buy into it.
Can be in the book is one of the Maya, and the Firbolgs that we're describing now would be exactly such a thing.
Yeah, he's very much a Dagda figure to me because like he is married to the river's daughter, so it's very much the Dagda being married to Bowen, who is the goddess of that area of Ireland, the River Boyne, and the hills around it.
Yep.
So it's very much similar to that, and Taltu as well. Taltu has land out there, where near Yakid is buried.
Right, and then you also have the specific marriages with Iru and Banba, the three greater deities from whom Ireland takes its name, and then of course there's the Morrigan, who may be all of people but none of them.
Sure.
Yes,
and is at least three people in and of herself.
Well, that's something that D&D has touched on in the past too. I forget which edition it was, where there was this concept of a lot of Firbolgs would pray to or revere this Morgan-like trinity of it was Melora, the Raven Queen, and Sehanine? I forget. I may be getting that wrong. But that was something.
It sounds like 4th edition if it was the Raven Queen. The Raven Queen didn't exist prior to 4th.
Right, yeah.
I do like the Raven Queen, by the way. It's one of the 4th edition bits that I found interesting was their
I like her too, as long as she's separate from Morrigan. I agree. She's very much not
Morgan and the Celtic gods are themselves.
That's something I wish they'd lean back into. Like, don't get me wrong, like 2nd edition when they did the Celtic gods, they butchered. It is miserable, and I am pissed off about it at all times.
The Celtic gods in the 5th edition book are
identical to the 2nd edition ones. Yeah, it's like, for some reason, like across all the like 1st edition and 2nd edition, there's a slight change, but every other deity set of gods that are like from Earth, that are Earth gods, they all change every edition. The Celts have not changed since 2nd edition, and they are horrible. I don't know who made that list, but I'm going to find them and.
Well, the Egyptians, while they've changed, haven't gotten a lot better. They still have they still have set as lawful evil or neutral evil.
Yeah, it's not great.
You know who that guy is? Because
it doesn't work.
Evil. He's a force of chaos.
Well, but that'll
listen, trying to destroy everything.
That gets us into a whole different conversation about alignment in D&D, and how inherently problematic it is as well, both mechanically and
it does, but even then, not even counting alignment, just talking cosmologically.
Oh, sure, yes.
He's a very different entity in that regard. And that is another topic we will slate for a Sunday sometime, is pagan deity, their place in tabletop lore.
Marty over in chat, D&D lore continuity is basically a game of telephone. Like that. That's so valid.
It's a game of telephone with a very bad provider.
Yeah.
Yes.
A lot of it actually, interestingly enough, D&D got a lot of its stuff from Howard.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
In
So
terms
there's
of
a lot of that flavor that's still there.
its perspective on deities, because it was set as the serpent god came out of Robert E. Howard's stuff, because at the time they had made that misinterpretation through the Victorian archaeologists.
Yeah. Oh, that's a big topic. But one of the things that bugs me about things like that is that a lot of the kind of the Celtic flavor that is in D&D, it's kind of this misinterpretation of like Howard's hyper masculinity, hyperborea stuff.
Yeah.
Where everyone has to be like a Cimmerian and run around with their angry
because
ways.
the Cimmerian or Cimmerian is, if you're paying attention, is the Celtic insert. He worships Crom.
Yep.
He associates with Aesir and Vanir. He fights the Picts. Like, this is all supposed to be pre-history, but you have, it's very...
Between the time when the oceans drank Atlantis and the rise of the sons of Arius.
Yeah, it's a fun setting. Don't get me wrong. I love Conan. However, his understanding of mythology was sketchy at best.
Not very good.
Best.
I'll say it was shit. I don't mind. I'll be that person.
It was, yeah.
It was shit.
This Texan who had this hyper, like, masculine complex and, like, some weird issues with his mom and didn't know what to do with himself. So he took pictures of himself and talked to his buddies.
Yeah, that's 100% what happened.
Yeah. But a lot of people also misunderstand Conan because they look at him through the modern lens, and they miss a lot of things about him. For instance, while Robert E. Howard's friend and fellow writer with whom he shared bits of lore, and they both contributed to the Cthulhu mythos, Conan's part of the Cthulhu mythos. But Robert E. Howard himself was not a racist, whereas Lovecraft was. Most people don't realize that Conan had at least 3 women of color as long-term romantic partners.
Galit of the Black Coast.
And people keep drawing Belit as a white woman, and it makes me mad.
Yes. Yeah.
But yeah, he had 3 separate women of color as long-term romantic partners who he did not see as any different from any other romantic partner. There was at least one Kushian hero who Conan said was a better fighter than himself and a more noble man, etc., etc.
Yeah. And that's one of the things that, like, there's that divide between what Howard wrote and then what Gygax incorporated, because he wanted to just be basically a Conan simulator, and it came across a little weird. Like, they didn't introduce sensitivity readers to D&D and then stopped using them afterwards until Al-Qadim. And Al-Qadim is a fantastic setting. It's amazing. And they really should have done a lot more of that stuff. I've never gotten
to run or play
they did not bother doing any research around that. But Al-Qadim, oh my God, I could talk and talk and talk about it.
Yep. So anyway, we're looking basically at Firbolg, who remain a Fey type, basically, are specific to possibly a tutelary type, not necessarily deities, but tied to the land, right? And if you have greater and lesser Firbolg, then you might have those that in long term are tutelary deities and tied to the land, and then the lesser ones are out maybe looking for their feature.
Sure. Well, you've got this thing where even in 5th edition, right, one of the things that they do push through is this idea that they are the protectors of the forest, right? So building on that, removing the forest from it as the sole place where they can be those protectors, but you do still keep a lot of that conceptual, like, thought where you go, well, they are the protectors of these lands. And you can have this really interesting exploration where, like you said, there are greater and lesser, or even if you don't want to do it that way and go with the elder Firbolgs are the ones who have found their place, have settled here, much like Druids in 2nd edition. They've made their home here, and this is where they are. And younger Firbolgs go out in search of where that is going to take them and what they are going to find to settle on and call as the place that they protect.
I think
there's that line from Monte Cristo, that movie in the 20s, or I guess the 30s, that find your own tree.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
I think I actually, that's probably what I meant more than lesser and greater.
Okay. Yeah.
In terms of, the more
the difference between a druid and an archdruid in 2nd edition.
Exactly.
Yeah. Druids have found, they're doing their thing and exploring, but archdruids are set up, and that's what I call him Tolm, but the lawful neutral and friends.
Yeah.
Shout out to Bridgetown, by the way, massive success on Kickstarter. But basically, so basically the difference in that would be the difference between an archdruid and kind of the lesser druid across the levels and titles, which is something I miss, but at the same time don't miss. The fact that like all the levels had these titles tied to them, and like as the cleric leveled up, they did a new title.
The idea that you would all eventually settle down and have a stronghold, which
and that's tied into classes like the fighter and the paladin.
Yeah. Also, just gonna call out chat one more time. Lawful neutral goes Elder Firbolg slowly incorporating into the landscape itself, and I really like that idea.
I knew he would go there. That's
the finality of it, right? When they make that transition, they're coming to the end of their lives. Yeah, please.
Sorry, responding to chat.
Yeah.
Ireland has less forest than most European countries, Casino Duelist, because the English came in, cut down all the forest, and replaced them with sheep.
Yeah, there's a reason for that.
Ireland was called the Emerald Isle because it was covered in forest, as was the majority of Scotland.
Yeah, the song Bonnie Portmore, for those who are Highlander fans, is specifically about the destruction of the forest of
correct.
Bonnie Port.
Correct. I love that song. I've sung it so many times. It always makes me cry.
It's beautiful.
I do like that, Marty. When their life is finished, they lay down and become boulders, or if they're in the forested area, they become trees. He is right that if we're going to use Firbolgs, it should be in a setting in the area that does feel Irish.
Yeah,
or at least we don't. One of the things I like to do is keep settings, the culturally influenced parts of them at least, specific to those cultures. One of the things that we get that I think messes things up and genericizes it is when you have all these things from 20 or 30 different cultures thrown into one country.
I think
that gets messy.
And that country looks on the surface just like a pastiche of Southern England. In the 1500s.
I think there's a really important balance to be struck there, right? Because you don't want to go too far on either side of the scale where you completely isolate every culture into its own lands. You also don't want to, like you said, go all the way the other way where everything exists in this one place and really it's just England. But what you can do
one of the reasons
you
bring in the successor states of Rhaegar, that Scaria has a very distinct identity and has things that live there that aren't as common elsewhere. But there's plenty of things that are seen all over the successor states. But you don't see the Nordic giants because they're up north.
Sure. But I think it is really interesting to be able to acknowledge that there is a culture, two cultures, three cultures that are the primary cultures of an area and have shaped their history and shaped their heritage, and then to bring in pieces because inevitably people will come in bringing their own cultures with them and exploring exploring how that grows and shifts and shapes things over time. So yeah, I think if we're talking mostly about that conversation of like, what do we envision Firbolgs to be, then yeah, the primary thing should be to focus on places that harken back to Irish landscapes. But I do think it's really interesting beyond that part of this thought experiment to then also go, okay, well, what happens when parts of their culture move outwards as well, and how that's
which is part of the myth of the Firbolg too,
right? Exactly,
because like they left Ireland as refugees and came to Greece. They have this connection. Of course, you have to go back and remember that that's part of the Irish monks writing it down and trying to legitimize it to an audience outside of Ireland that was very well versed in Celtic mythology. But basically, they do have that connection to Greece geographically and to the areas of Greece, which is wildly different from Ireland. But at the same time, you do have to contextualize them into the context that they were originally from. That like the Firbolg are specifically entrenched in this Irish landscape. So you do need to consider that. But you also have to consider that the Irish landscape isn't, even with the trees, it's still a diverse place.
Yeah,
areas like the Burren is pretty remote. It doesn't have a lot of forest because it cannot sustain it because it's rock. It's pure rock. So it's a pretty desolate place.
So what you get in that regard, so as the Celts move down into Brittany, you have a similar race in origin that ends up looking 100% different, but acting much the same, called the Corrin.
Yes.
Or the Corrigan, depending on what part of Brittany you're in. right? And they also are tied to place, and they also are protectors of a natural location. And they also are very much Fey folk.
Yes.
So, and they're the short ones, just like we believe that maybe the original Firbolg probably were not necessarily as short as dwarves, but then I don't necessarily think dwarves were as short as they're described, because exaggeration goes both ways, and any story that wants to be entertaining exaggerates.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So yeah. And if you think, okay, well, they're a little shorter than some of these other people and they have rounded bellies and they're kind of stooped. Well, the Kored is short, stooped, and has fawn's legs, which makes them look even more stooped, and has very tied to the rock specifically, interestingly, as we were talking about those areas of Ireland. One of the things that Ireland has in common with Greece is a very rocky landscape, even though Ireland is much more fertile.
Yes. So it's also worth noting, going back kind of building, like if you wanted to use the Firbolg as a basis for something, that as a people, they emphasize basically warrior prowess a lot more over magic, because Chaltu is considered kind of an outlier as far as that goes, because she's a sovereign goddess, of course, but there's not just sorcerers running around among the very few records of Firbolg. Most of them are warriors, like the survivor of basically the leader after Yakut, who's not a king. He was the champion who won his contests, and therefore his name is String. He is basically their greatest warrior. So they're a very warlike people who have kind of a martial tradition that goes back. And Ireland has a lot of very unique martial traditions, like throwing a spear with his toes. It's pretty damn unique. But then there's also like shillelagh martial arts and forms of boxing and other stuff that we've lost, some of them we haven't lost. Yeah. But there's a lot of it that is very unique, and so you might want to draw that in with the Firbolg.
Mm-hmm. No, you're not wrong. To take it back a little bit, we were talking about the Druids.
Yes.
What needs to be understood about the Druids in context, I believe, is that 1, they are priests. 2, they are judges. 3, they are also magicians. These are 3 different things.
Yes.
In terms of their priestly orientation, they're actually a lot more like clerics, because they do in fact call on the gods, not necessarily on nature all the time. In terms of judges, well, that's because of how because they're political leaders, as you pointed out, they must be trained in the law and all that. One of the reasons Julius Caesar chose to begin destroying the Druids when he encountered them in Gaul was because they were the only other culture that, like Rome, combined their theological and political leaders. They allowed other peoples to keep their gods because their priestly caste and their leaders were separate. The Druids were both in one. Rome saw them as a threat. But something a lot of people don't know is that Bard is actually just the first degree of Druid.
Mm-hmm.
You start out at 14 years old, you can become a harper. You harp for a bard for 7 years. At 7, you can become a harper. You harp for a bard for 7 years. At age 14 or 21, depending, you could become a bard, right? 7 years later, after you're a bard, no, I was right. It's 14 is the harper, 21 is a bard. 7 years later, you could become an Olav, which is the judge. And 7 years after that is the earliest you could become a druid. Which is interesting because that puts us at the age of 35. Lion, why is 35 important to a certain other group in terms of mystic meanings?
I have no idea what you possibly could be talking about. Go ahead.
Are you being serious right now?
No,
I hope you're not being serious.
No.
Go ahead.
Man, I would hope not. My goodness, put me on the spot. So, are you talking about for the? Actually, hang on. Let me make sure I know what I'm talking about. You're talking about for the Tetragrammaton?
I'm talking about rabbinical lore and
Okay, yeah.
I'm talking about rabbinical lore and Kabbalah.
I'm making sure that we're calling on me because of my Jewish heritage.
We are.
Yeah, I mean it's so there's a lot of reasons actually with 35 in Judaism. It's not just in Kabbalah. I mean, it's difficult getting into because there's a lot of cultural concepts that make discussing ideas within Kabbalah like an issue for public
Yes.
like gatherings. So
technically, we're not supposed to talk about it
right.
all, and I didn't know.
Yeah. So there is some stuff that I don't know that I want to get into.
That's fine. I'll do a real quick overview.
Fair.
Basically, 35 is the same age you must be technically to be a rabbi, and it is the age you must be in order to study Kabbalah. You must also be married for both of these.
Correct. And a man. Unfortunately.
Yes, and a man.
Yeah.
I will
that
also
one I can mention.
It is the same age at which you are allowed to become president.
True.
We're not getting into that as wise, but it is interesting anyway.
Let's not feed the conspiracy machines. I think there are plenty of people out there who have done that already.
Probably so. All right, so yeah, I think I really like the idea of our Firbolg, as I said, being those same sorts of entities, but you're right, they are mostly martial, right? Even the Tuatha have a higher percentage of magic wielders, but they're still primarily actually a warrior people. Being a druid meant you were a powerful sorcerer as well as a priest, as well as all these things, and you were given, amongst the Tuatha at least, more respect for it, right?
Yes.
And you could be both that and a warrior.
Yes, like the Dagda with his with his club of life and death, very much so.
One end kills you, the other end brings you back to life with his cauldron of plenty, and the associated cauldron of rebirth. And how weird that got. It may be a very important piece of my Fomor folio, and why Baelor doesn't stay completely dead. But anyway, but yeah, the Firbolg as the specifically land tied and land protecting, and a young Firbolg goes looking for the place that they are intended to protect in their old age, basically. So you have a built-in reason for every Firbolg basically to be an adventurer.
Yeah. And you don't have to worry about finding the hooks of they've been removed from their tribe because they don't really trust anyone. This is where they stay. And honestly, it's great because that does inherently just open up so much more exploration that doesn't have to be tied to, well, one of my driving forces, no matter what else my personality is or my wants or my needs is that I have been removed from my tribe.
Right. Whereas in this case, you can have them go, no, I just happen to be an adolescent, and that means I have to go see the world to find out where I'm supposed to be.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. Yeah.
And I think it's cool because it gives us that more of a wholesome, less edgelord potential.
I mean, yeah, you don't have
run
to
wildly from edgelord. Run wildly.
Do it on purpose.
Yeah. It's actually
instead of it just being built into every Firbolg.
Yeah, it's actually really funny. So for the world that we use for DTA, which is Rodain, which I wrote, we have similar concepts, except instead of being applied to what would be our Firbolgs, we have it for our they're called the Maliko. So they're like our take on the Tabaxi, and they're based on a lot of traveler cultures. So it takes this concept of going out, seeing the world, finding the places that mean things to you, and that is what comprises your home and the value of what is around you. And I really like to see
that.
I like that. Yeah.
You may have noticed that in the successor states of Rhaega, both the elves and the dwarves fall into two different aspects of the same thing we've talked about for the Firbolgs.
Yep.
The dwarves were specifically for the stone lands and the underground lands, and the elves were very specifically the protectors of all the natural locations above ground. Because again, it's that when you understand that the elves as we know them come from a combination of Norse myth and Celtic myth kind of fused together,
Right.
Then you understand that they have to be
Yes.
tutelary. They have to be spirits of place, right? That's even what the Alfar completely are in the Norse, and
Yes.
to a lesser extent, with Disinchas, etc., the Tuatha De Danann also are. So the combination is very clear there. If you haven't read it, I do suggest looking at one of my wilder theories that I have on my blog, which is the Asir Vanir Tuatha De Danann connection.
It's a good read.
Okay.
Oh, it's
I'll have to look at
absolutely
that.
wild. You just look on the blog, you can find it. It's
Okay.
it's back, but yeah, it's a wild and totally unsubstantiated theory. I'll say it straight out.
Yes, but it's a lot of fun. I really
And
I
there
really
is that
enjoyed it.
suggestion that Tuatha De Danann, the North doesn't mean Britain. It could mean Scandinavia, and one of the 4 cities could be in Scandinavia. So
What's interesting about that as well, of course, is depending on which version of the story you hear, especially some that have been less humorized, the Tuatha De Danann come down from the north or the sky
yes,
in flying ships from their flying cities.
yes. Which my mind always jumps to Studio Ghibli Castle in the Sky, Laputa, which near and dear to my heart. But
yeah, so if you take, I tend to take a more pagan perspective on it, and that's hard to do, of course, because as we say, that all the sources we have are post-pagan. But when you take a pagan look at the materials and go, if they are gods, if they were originally gods, this is what they are. Here's how they connect with the pan-Celtic peoples and the deities that the pan-Celtic peoples worshipped. Like I pointed out that Lu and Tyrannus have many, many similarities.
Right.
That Lu is both a later stage sun god and a later stage storm god.
Storm god, yeah.
Which then connects Bel, who may be Danu's husband, with that whole cycle as the earliest storm and sun god. But
yes,
he is or isn't killed by the Fomor at some point. Anyway,
right. The first generation have like maybe 3 paragraphs if I'm remembering properly.
right.
It's not.
And then Dagda is either Danu's husband or her son or both.
Yeah. There's a whole issue there about like the genealogy of Irish gods is miserable.
Yeah, it gets really rocky very quickly, and it's tough.
I do have a specific version of it for my Knights of the Broken Wheel setting, which is what the Fomor Folio came out of. You have to have a version of it if you're still have these people worshiping these gods and those gods really exist and occasionally talk to you.
I mean, yeah.
You have to have a version. So, yeah, Knights of the Broken Wheel I'm pretty proud of because it's a purely Celtic, pseudo-Arthurian setting.
Okay, I thought it was going to go in that direction when you said it from the name.
Incorporating Fomor and the She rather than elves and orcs, and basically treating the Fomor as the progenitors of what would later be called the Unseelie Court, and the She as the progenitors of the Seelie, because conceptually they really are. And the Broken Wheel is a wheel from Tyrannus's chariot.
Right.
Fell off during a battle in the sky. And it is a huge broken wheel that they now use as a round table.
Oh, I love that.
Okay. Very cool.
But yeah,
I like that.
Yeah, so I definitely, on one of these episodes, I'll get you back on for the Fomor episode because there's a lot more to cover in the Fomor, including their World of Darkness incarnation.
I'm clearly going to have to look at how they're incorporated into World of Darkness because the fairy lore in World of Darkness is a little beyond what I was into.
The World of Darkness have nothing to do with the Fae.
Well, that's not a bad thing necessarily.
No.
Kind of.
It depends on the framing, but yeah.
The framing is
specifically from Werewolf the Apocalypse, which you had already
Okay.
Mhm.
Yeah, I played Werewolf once and I hate it. So I didn't dive into the lore too much. I just remember the
I
Fianna was
prefer
like the only thing I cared about.
of the World of Darkness werewolf. I prefer Werewolf the Forsaken.
I prefer everything New World Darkness. Like
Yeah.
everything on New
Mostly
World is
that's what
my
I
bread.
do. I am in the process of building a version of the setting that incorporates the parts I like about Old World
Oh yeah, you can still easily, yeah.
into the New World, specifically for a charity game later this year that is going to be Mage the Awakening and Mage the Ascension merged.
Nice. Okay.
Because Phil Bricado and Bill Bridges have tentatively agreed to be in the charity game.
Hey, that sounds fun.
Yeah.
So I was like, oh my God, no pressure. I'm just going to run Mage for the two guys who created it.
Wrote it. Yeah. No big deal.
No pressure.
Oh, but anyway, yeah. So it really is interesting how, like I said, how we go from Firbolg, who may or may not have been absolutely normal people, if a bit short and maybe pot-bellied, depending on your interpretation of Bolga. But we also, if we incorporate all those interpretations of the bag, then we've got relatively short, pot-bellied people who had a bag around their neck and carried bags of dirt back and forth from Ireland to Greece, which gives us very much that tie to the land that you were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
But what's interesting about it there is, to me, possibly because of too much time spent in the World of Darkness and other vampire settings, they're carrying their native earth.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And they are tied to technically death, undeath. What state are they in?
Yeah.
Right. So that's an interesting
definitely going on it. Yeah. Especially if you kind of try to, I guess, not necessarily Christianize it, but kind of bring in like a little bit of Christian Phalor with like iron and whatnot. So then you can make that a little, okay, they're not demons per se. They're just fallen angels that aren't evil, and you have to do something about them.
Right.
Maybe stab them in the heart, or maybe stab them in the bag. Who knows?
Probably stab them in the bag.
I think.
And the question at that point is,
most people should be stabbed in the bag.
That's the interesting thing, of course, is because then you have to interpret it. Which of these three bags is it? Because I just remembered what the other interpretation of the bag is. It is, in fact, the scrotum.
Oh.
Hey.
I don't know. I'm just going to put it out there. I wouldn't want to carry dirt in my scrotum.
That is the other bag that some linguists believe they may have been referring to, because apparently in some descriptions, the Firbolg had large, saggy scrotums.
A lot like the Dagda.
Right. Very specifically, That is one of the references that is made. So that's
I do like this idea though, going back to your like pseudo vampire-ish concept for them, is this idea that, like you said, stabbing them in the bag, right, is that native dirt is necessary for their continued existence, right? It's even then, it's still the land they're tied to, and you can still really delve into that.
So while they're traveling, from my perspective, they would carry in that bag around their neck, bring the bags together, some of the earth from their native, from the place they were born, and they then incorporate it into their new territory when they move there.
Yeah.
Okay? Basically seeding themselves, marrying the land, seeding themselves into the land and bonding with it.
Which is technically what Dracula does at Carfax Abbey.
Correct.
It's true.
Which I think, again, is a great...
I love that.
And then you stab them in the bag because then they lose the dirt.
Yes.
And the dirt's what's keeping them alive when they're separated from their home.
Yeah, I love that. It also creates the reverse vampiric effect, where you have to kill a vampire in their coffin in like a lot of classic folklore. Whereas here, you can't kill them in their native lands. You have to wait for them to travel.
Right, because it's the king is the land kind of thing.
Exactly, yeah. And I really like that, yeah.
Very much. And if they're on their home turf goes, no, they didn't die. They just kind of moved into me for a minute while I rebuilt their body.
Yeah, they'll be back.
Oh.
Sackville Bagginses and Firbolgs teabagging the rocky fields of.
My God.
What's funny about the Sackville Bagginses is that Baggins is actually a pun having to do with cul-de-sac. Because they're at the end of the bag end is at the end of the bag, the end of the cul-de-sac hill, right? And the Sackville Bagginses are yet another reference to that.
Yeah.
Cul-de-sac living.
Love it.
But teabagging the rocky fields of Greece.
Speaking of the chat, I just on a whim checked my Discords, and if someone else makes a Pendulette joke, I'm going to murder a lot.
They have made a lot of Pendulette. I haven't checked your Discord, but not everyone, a lot of people who see me make Pendulette jokes.
I can't imagine why.
I am familiar with it.
Yeah.
We're not related. I don't know him, despite the fact that, we look similar and I am an atheist just as he is.
But your co-host talks, so it's already different. It's fine.
It is very much so. Also,
primary difference.
My co-host isn't that short and has hair.
It's true. Yeah.
Now,
actually, I am
short.
pretty short, actually.
I am perfectly average in that regard.
I am 6 foot, which means I'm slightly above average.
I'm a full-on. I'm just a living, walking, breathing fantasy dwarf.
It just makes me. My weight is what makes me unreasonable in terms of comparison to body, because no one ever believes me. I currently weigh 285 pounds, and when I'm in shape, I weigh more.
Right, because muscle weighs more. Yeah.
My bone and muscle density are significantly above norms to the point where I sink in water when I'm relaxed. I cannot.
Yeah.
That's the giant genes.
And I joined the Navy.
Solid plan. Solid plan. You stay on the boats, right? That's fine. The boats do the floating.
You have to pass a swim test.
Yeah.
You stay floating for an hour. I had to swim the whole time.
My God.
Well,
it's a lot harder than you think it is.
Oh, I believe it.
Luckily, I grew up in southern Louisiana and was in the water before I could walk.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah.
But anywho, it is the giant genes. It's one of the going back to one of the reasons I was so glad you picked Firbolg is because there are some schools of thought that believe that the Firbolg, and I believe I said I was going to get back to this at the beginning, that the Firbolg and the Picti and the Black Irish are all the same people. Because Connacht is the area of Ireland that was given to the Firbolg.
Yes, by the Tuatha Dé Danann.
By the Tuatha Dé Danann, when they said, okay, you could, we beat you, but you can still live here. And Connacht is the highest percentage of Black Irish in Ireland, if I'm correct. I could be wrong about that. It doesn't really matter at this point anyway, because they spread out so much. It's been thousands of years. It can be different. But sorry, that was Scottish, not Irish. I do both accents. I get them muddled sometimes. But my Irish and Scottish heritage are both strongly Black Irish and Pict, which you can probably tell by looking at me. There are not a lot of light-skinned blonde people even on my Irish side, even on my European side. So, but those people, and one of the reasons I like to think of the Firbolg as more connected to the dwarves. So when I saw it in Scion, it really resonated with me, is because dwarves, short, stocky, heavy, muscular, big-bellied, and while I'm 6 foot, the Vikings that we're interacting with and the Tuatha, apparently, according to all the stories, were much taller.
Yep.
6.5 feet to 7 feet was your average Tuatha.
And if the dwarves are, if they're Alvar, then they're super tall too.
Yeah, if the dwarves are Svartalfar, then they're not short. You're correct. That's another interesting topic that we will get into once again. You may end up having to come back a lot.
I find I do not have a problem with that.
We are also going to get other expert mythologists. Like one of the people I intend to get on here is Jürgen Hubert.
Yes, absolutely. He's fantastic.
When we start talking about some of the
I
German.
worked with, I was one of his alpha readers on his first book. I'm not sure. The second one's out. I need it, but
it is. Yeah,
he's utterly fantastic.
Yes, I talk with him all the time. He's the one who taught me about the Totenkopf spider, which I made stats for both GURPS and D&D.
Mm-hmm.
It's a fairly high CR creature, but it's tiny, and you don't see that very often.
Yeah, you really don't.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, some people have, because of the way I look, and the way I also act, because I'm very bardic, with the voice and the singing and all the lore and all that. Some people have called me a half elf, half orc, and from my perspective, orc because big, strong, I guess. But from my perspective, I'm more half elf, half dwarf. Although I do resonate with the half orc thing, just because the outsider feeling, because I've always been the outsider, and mixed race. So there's that.
I think the official Forgotten Realms turn is a dwelf.
Yeah. Yep.
We have a dwelf. I actually, one of my partners plays a dwelf in one of my games, and it's really, really fun. Yeah, there's a dwelf and her older sister who is actually just a half elf because they share a mom, not a dad. But their dad has adopted the older sister, so she's officially a dwarf. And is the one with stone cunning. The dwelf doesn't have stone cunning.
So you have a half elf dwarf and then a dwelf half dwarf.
Kind of.
Yeah.
It gets dicey.
Yeah.
Yeah. It can be a lot of fun. As you could probably tell, some of my worlds are a little faster and looser. That world started out as a Pathfinder world. Simply because I had translated Keep on the Borderlands into Pathfinder already. And then I made a Pathfinder 1E horror setting called Morgravia, which I then decided was the future of the Keep on the Borderlands setting. And now I've got 7 different timelines in that world, which is okay.
Welcome to Legend of Zelda.
It's okay, because one of the first thing that happens in that world is in the first God's War, the god of time gets killed and never gets replaced. So no matter what happens in any of the games, the other games aren't necessarily affected because time isn't fully causal. But anyway, yeah. I really have enjoyed this conversation about the Firbolg. And there are so many ways you can take what they actually were mythologically that, as we pointed out, the D&D just didn't do.
Right.
And again, in many ways, they're far more similar to the Welsh Spriggan than they are to the actual Firbolg, which is interesting because they did actually use the Spriggan in D&D as well, although they don't have them in the modern fight. But, they are in, I believe I put the Spriggan in my Fomorfolio. If I didn't, I made them. I should have put them in the Fomorfolio. But yeah, bunch of interesting stuff.
Now, this has been absolutely fantastic. I've enjoyed talking.
Good. We've enjoyed listening because I like talking to somebody who knows a whole bunch about this stuff. And the different perspectives on it is brilliant.
Yeah.
Yeah. A lot of different directions you can take this one.
Yep. But I think, unfortunately, due to the fact that so few games have addressed the Firbolg, we may have run out of ammunition for the day. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I think we've not to beat a dead bag, but we might have taken all the soil out of this one, so to speak.
Hey. Yeah, I think we covered everything we really needed to go over. I think we had a really good look at the history of the people and the concepts that became the fantasy people, and some ways that could be really interesting to explore a more earnest look at what the Firbolgs should be in these fantasy games versus what they've become.
And I think that our approach today, which I wasn't 100% certain how we were going to handle, of dealing with them only from a lore perspective rather than approaching the stat blocks, I think it's actually, I think it's more useful.
Yes.
Yes.
Like, we can make the stat blocks and put them out for people later if we want.
Sure.
But it's the
lore to me is the part that matters, and it's the part the most malleable. But at the same time,
right.
Especially, oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, and it's what, if we want people to understand the mythology and incorporate that mythology into their gaming, because who wouldn't want that? The intersection of mythology and gaming is where you and I live. And so much of it goes together really well. In a lot of ways, gaming, there's three things that are modern mythology, and that is gaming, comics, and comic book movies.
Mhm.
Folklore doesn't stop just because we're in modern day.
Yes.
Now, we have to be careful because pop culture and folklore aren't synonymous.
Yeah,
Yep.
and sometimes they can be kind of dicey with what they do with folklore and just divorce it entirely. Like, let's steal a name and make it complete.
Right.
Mhm.
But we also have the fact that that pop culture represents folklore in its own right
Yes.
without being completely folklore sourced. It's,
Yes.
but we also have to keep in mind, okay, is it still folklore if it has also been curated and sold to us in a package by a corporation? The answer is unfortunately yes, after it makes it back out into the public.
That's the problem.
Right,
Well, that goes back
because-
to what was being said about it being like telephone, right? Because that's really what happens here is legitimate concepts, legitimate cultural like norms get taken, corporatized, genericized, packaged into whatever they want, pushed out, and then there's a whole bunch of people who see that for the first time and go, this is what this means. And then so they spread that back into the world, and it's how we get a lot of the shifts that we see now.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And
Don't-
even like if you were to delegitimize the corporate, you also have to delegitimize the scholars who have gone back and tried to revitalize it, like Lady Gregory and William Butler Yeats and all these people. And technically,
Right.
wouldn't you also have to invalidate the Christian monk who wrote it down in the first place?
I mean, yes.
Absolutely.
So legitimacy is not something that is like it comes through a sorts of things. It's something that has to come through an authenticity that speaks of the people for the people and continues to have a communication that makes sense to people in the modern day.
That was a
So
note
true.
that was made by a TikTok creator, and he was talking about comics, how faithfulness to the character is more important than the details, right?
Mhm.
That's the same basic thing here. It is not important that we keep all the same details about the stories, because after all, we've already said this, there is no canon, either in myth or in tabletop role playing.
Yeah.
So we can't delegitimize anything. We can go, I prefer this take because it captures the essence of the story, which is why, to me, for instance, in Greek myth terms, Ovid is not canon. Because Ovid was an atheist of the time whose express purpose was to make the Greek gods look bad. His stories in Metamorphosis are the only time Poseidon rapes anyone. Medusa, in the original version, is born a monster, one of the three Gorgons. Not until Ovid, a Roman, was she raped in Athena's temple.
And that's one of the things with modern stuff too, is like a lot of people
But that's
come
the
to
one-
Norse mythology through because of Thor and Loki. But like
Mhm.
it doesn't matter to me that Thor and Loki are brothers in Marvel. That doesn't
That's not
matter. It
critical.
doesn't has no bearing on the fact that their representation of Thor isn't that inaccurate from the actual
No.
myths. Like that's still Thor. He's still this
Yeah.
semi-noble wanderer who's kind of doing his own thing. Like if anything,
Protecting
it's
people-
getting
he
the
protects-
cycle and recycling it and making
Yeah.
it like do something new. Now, granted, you can only do that
Has-
so many times.
Of the Aesir, he is probably the only one who is universally known as a protector of man.
Yes.
Mhm.
People who called on Odin did not call on him for protection. They called on him for power. They called on him for knowledge, and they called on him to please leave me the hell alone.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
Whereas Thor was the god of every common man and the warrior.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas Odin was the god called on by nobles and kings and madmen and singers.
Yes, very much so.
So yeah, it's far more important to get at the essence of the character, the essence of the concept, the essence of the monster to bring it back to what we're doing.
Mm-hmm.
It is more important to get at the essence of the being than to get the details right. And I think what we've actually shown here, contrary to maybe what we were planning, is that they did with the Firbolg. Right?
To an extent, yeah.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
very much tied to the land, very much protectors thereof. The essence is still there.
Right.
And I think I am surprised to have seen them get that right, mostly by accident.
Yes.
Yes, yeah.
The giant thing is a little irksome, but that's not a big deal.
Yeah.
Not a huge.
Lawful neutral, do you mean flightings?
What was the question?
Speaking of Norse myth, there need to be more nithings in games. I'm asking if they mean flightings, which is the ancient Norse rap battle. Oh, no, the curse. Okay, yeah. That's different.
Although I agree with both, I do think we need more ancient Norse rap battles in games. I think that definitely needs to be done more.
Yes.
Yeah.
That could be a whole game itself.
100%.
One of the interesting things about that is the only person to ever beat Loki in a flighting was Thor. Despite
Which is ironic given our perspective.
Normally is portrayed as fairly stupid, but he's quick-witted.
Mm-hmm.
One of my favorite myths when I read the Eddas for the first time in preparation for season 2 was it's an older myth that people speculate that originally Thor took on a different role in the pantheon of that particular pantheon of Scandinavia, where basically he comes back from his wandering and there's this dwarf that's waiting on him to basically challenge him to a game of wits and riddles. Mm-hmm. And Odin has got sick of him because he's been outwitted. And so basically, like this dwarf is just sitting there and like, all right, I want to have this battle with you, and if you lose, I get to marry your daughter. And Thor's like, yeah, whatever. Okay, if I win, you're probably gonna die. And so the dwarf agrees to it, and they can have their battle of wits, and Thor easily outwits him. And so the dude, instead of being killed by Thor, just straight up Rumpelstiltskins and explodes.
Yeah, yeah.
It's one of my favorite stories from the 80s.
Because Thor's daughter, a lot of people don't know anything about, but she has not one but 2 names and is one of the only named Valkyries. Mm-hmm. Probably. If there's a question of like, who the Valkyrie are. If that name Thrudr is both people.
Right.
But she is also called Megan, and she probably, as far as I'm concerned, probably is the daughter of Thor and one of Valkyria or Valkyrior. But yeah, she's pretty interesting. I actually had one of my players in a Mutants and Masterminds game play her.
Okay, that's pretty neat.
And then her, half brothers showed up on the side of the giants, and they were mad because Magni and Modi were mad because her father liked her better and all that.
Right. I haven't played the new God of War games, but I was a little perturbed to learn how they treated Thor's sons, but less perturbed about Thor himself and his daughter. I was actually really happy with how that worked out.
I was perturbed at how they treated Magni and Modi and how Thor was treating Magni and Modi.
Yeah, that was pretty awesome.
Yeah.
God of War. The way Thor is portrayed in Ragnarok is a huge step up. And I'm fully on board with how they portray Odin as bad.
100%. Yeah. There should be more depictions of Odin as a dick.
Yes.
Like
yes.
This Anthony Hopkins shit has to stop.
100%.
The visual for Thor is the best Thor that has ever been Thored.
Bar none.
For the Dagda, which is not really a big surprise.
I will say, in regards to the Anthony Hopkins one specifically, it's actually really funny they took that route because in even most of the Marvel comic depictions of Odin, he is a giant dick. That is still totally true. Is. Yeah, it was really strange that was the way that they went with it. But, what are you going to do?
They kind of tried to salvage it with Ragnarok. About like, he actually was trying to conquer the multiverse and decided it was a bad idea, and so he stops. But Hela was okay. Well, okay, That's this one moment of dickage.
Yeah, but that's it. And it's not even.
Ragnarok
It's an
made me
off-screen
more
moment.
mad.
Yeah.
Ragnarok's the way they threw Ragnarok around made me more mad at the MCU than I ever was at the Marvel version of Thor before.
Mm-hmm.
Because at least Hela was still Loki's daughter in the comics.
Yep. Yeah.
What is this making her Thor's older sister thing? What the?
It's very weird.
It's a movie trope move. Like it's something you do see a lot of the times in storytelling in movies where they need to introduce this character. They want to immediately impose upon you that they are powerful, and the way that they did that in this instance is by going, yeah, well, she's older than them. She was around when Odin was being a dick. Clearly, she's going to be strong, and it's just a trope that they leaned heavy into because it solved them not having to do what they did anyway with dropping a bunch of lore at once just cause.
Marty, your anti-Irish bias is showing. The Firbolg do not have to have an affinity for root vegetables. Thank you. But anyway, so we are
ahistorical.
We are actually quite past our. We are a little bit past our prime, and we have covered everything we intended to cover. So I would just like to say thank you very much, Greg, for coming on the Godyssey podcast as our guest is marvelous. I am honored that you're here, and it was a lot of fun talking to you. So I look forward to doing so again in the very near future. We'll figure it out. It may be as early as next week. Who knows? I'll try to get I'll try to get some other guests, but you may be stuck.
It's been an absolute blast. I've enjoyed it. It's been fantastic. Good. This has been a good conversation and a lot of creative stuff going on.
I will tell you that if you come back next week, we're just going to segue right into Fillmore. It seems like the obvious.
I mean, because we keep touching on it here, right? Like that's the clear place to go.
Can't do Firbolg without
concepts. So keeping them together in the season, as it were, seems like a good idea. But anyway,
I'll have to check my schedule on that if it's going to be next week, though.
Well, it can be next week or the week after. We'll figure something out.
Right.
We will work around the schedule of everyone involved.
Mm-hmm.
But thank you very much for being here. I have been Jack Kellum. This is Of Gods and Game Masters. This is Myths and Monsters and was about Firbolgs, although we did digress here and there. And my fantastic co-host and producer, the Lion Knight himself.
That's me. Hi, I'm Lion. You can find me at the Lion Knight 42 over on Twitter. I'm the creative director and founder for Tales from the Table Studios, who you can also find pretty much everywhere. We do a bunch of tabletop RPG, actual play stuff, interviews with people, a lot of cool stuff, including hosting an amazing series that Jack has written and runs for us. We just finished season 2 and are working on season 3 and are very excited to be able to bring you that soon. Thank you so much for allowing me to be a part of this, because I really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you for being here so that I could have this conversation without having to learn rafts and rafts of more tech. Greg, what would you like to say?
It's been an absolute pleasure and honor to be here. Happy to be a guest again. If you want to find me, I am on everything as the Godyssey Podcast. Mostly active on Twitter, taking part in the daily hashtags. You can also find me at Sassafras Studios on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. I am starting to make tabletop stuff. Primarily thus far has been for 5e and the DMs Guild in particular. Looking to expand for obvious reasons into other directions. So far I've drawn a lot on folklore. So far the two related things are folklore of the Feywild and folk of the Feywild, which create some borrow from mythology, borrow from D&D's history, fuse the two, throw it out there. And folklore has actually been fantastic so far. It's been selling very well, already a copper bestseller. If you want to go and buy either one of them, I'm very happy to let you do that. Please do that. Anyway, happy to be here, happy to be back, and happy to talk about the Fomorians, ready to talk about everything else.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, so speaking of the Fomor, he has his folklore and his you said Feywild folklore?
So the two products I have on the DMs Guild are called Folklore of the Feywild and Folk of the Feywild. I do have a lot of the Fomorians in primarily folklore, where I talk about kind of their history, their connection to the the Seelie and Unseelie courts, and kind of where they fit in the D&D cosmology, how it basically fits into pre-4th edition lore and 4th edition lore, where the Fomorians are actually featured as a major villain.
Nice. Okay, so I also have a supplement on the Fomor that is over on Drive-Thru called the Fomor Folio. So if you guys want to take a look at that, it posits a different idea of what the Fomor are and where they fit into any cosmology, because it's intended to allow you to take these Celtic monsters and bring them into any setting, even if it's not Celtic. So just take a look at it and let us know. Thank you all for watching. We love you very much. And this has been Of Gods and Game Masters. And we are out.